Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to episode 61 of Quarantine. This begins our first anniversary observance of what we've all been through for the last year. 61 episodes. And today we actually want to start looking back and framing and ask the question, what happened? And we want to look at this last year through the lens of understanding media. Because one thing that the pandemic has done is it's sped up the future. It brought all at once working from home, having our virtual lives perhaps exceed our physical lives. We rubbed up against the value systems that we've had as our traditional American value systems established in the Enlightenment, based on science, based on objective truth. And we've run into what happens when we have multiple voices and maybe that's not so self-evident. We've done a bunch of shows on this, and now we're kind of giving ourselves permission to frame it and step back a little bit. And we're having on our show today several people who are just completely steeped in this. Michael Sakassis is a scholar and an author and wrote a fabulous piece a year ago called The Analog City and the Digital City that framed a great deal of us. Also joining us today is Andrew McLuhan, runs the McLuhan Institute, grandson of Marshall McLuhan. And so much of the way that McLuhan looked at the world and understanding how the messages of media was how they changed us is at work today. And then also joining us today is our friend, author David Sachs, who a few years ago wrote the book, Revenge of the Analog. And he's working on a successor also on this topic of what happened. Hey, Mick, welcome.
Hey, Peter. I'm excited about this episode. I remember when you first sent me the article, The Analog City and the Digital City, and I think I got like maybe a paragraph in and I was just like, oh, my brain can't handle it later last year. But then in prep for this show, I ended up having a chance of reading through it, and it is just chock full of wonderful observations and insights. And so I'm super excited to have Michael on the show. And I just like the combination of people that we have today. So this will be fun. And especially fun having Andrew back to talk to us, and maybe even have a dead guest. We don't know. We'll see how that goes.
Could be. And Mick, one of the reasons I thought this would be interesting is we've done a lot of close-in observation of what's going on. We had Yael Eisenstadt talk to us about what it was like in the Facebook election room in 2016, dealing with the incoming bots, right? We've had a couple of shows on algorithmic bias. We've seen the symptoms of what we're going through, eloquently kind of set out. And the question is, what sits above those symptoms that's going on that perhaps we don't understand, but is a seismic shift, not just in technology, but how we conceive ourselves, and therefore the government trying to put together. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Why don't we just say hello to everybody and then welcome our first guest. So Here's who's here. Here's Michael Sakassis. Michael, welcome.
Good to be here.
If any of you saw, here's David Sachs, author of Revenge of the Analog. And if any of you saw the film Annie Hall, when a question came up about McLuhan, Woody Allen brought in McLuhan. We're bringing in Andrew McLuhan because it's always good to have the McLuhan Institute handy when talking about these things. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, everybody.
It's great.
Good to see everyone.
Okay, we're going to bring you guys back in a moment, and this is going to be a lot of fun. Michael, let's start with you. I first became aware of you when I read your piece in the New Atlantis. Tell us something about that publication's kind of perspective on science and how you're approaching things, and your own perspective in Gainesville at Christian Study University.
Yeah, so the New Atlantis has been around, I think, going back to the early 2000s. I'm not on their masthead, so I'll just speak as a writer and an admiring reader for many years. And I think that what has distinguished their work has been an open but critical spirit towards technological society. They don't speak merely as naysayers of new technology, but as a publication that wants to take seriously the challenge of new technology, so sociologically, politically, morally, intellectually. And they've had a number of wonderful writers throughout the years that have taken on all sorts of different issues raised by our sort of techno-scientific development, and have done so, in my view, very wisely, sanely, and humanely. And so it was a pleasure for me to be invited by Ari Schulman, the current editor, to begin writing for them occasionally back a couple of years, and this was my latest piece for them. So they're a great publication, and I certainly recommend their work, especially during this past year. I think they've provided great coverage, particularly of the pandemic and our governmental response to it, and how we think about science as a society, which has become such a convoluted issue at present.
And your own beat on your blog and your own writing has been looking at a lot of this from a number of perspectives, right? You've been continually kind of looking, and in particular, one of the conceits of this article in your writing is the society we think we're in, the Western democracy we grow in with a set of principles, is changing very quickly underneath us, but we're acting like it's not changing, and we just have to go fix a few things.
Right, exactly. And so I'm delighted to have Andrew here. McLuhan was in this talk that I gave, Marshall McLuhan, but some of those passages got excised for the final article. So I'm essentially, a media ecologist in background as regards to these issues. And I cite Postman in the article saying that, Europe after the printing press is not just old Europe plus the printing press, it's a new thing. And I think that to me is pretty self-evident. And I think we're in the midst of that same sort of transition, that once you drop digital technologies into modern society, you don't just get the old analog society plus digital technologies. You get something new institutions, new assumptions, a new experience of subjectivity. And I think we are in a liminal state, as it were, right? We don't know what the end result of that will be, but we do know that we are changing. And I think there are some in society that are sort of more aware of that than others. And certainly I think that these older thinkers, whether it's McLuhan or Postman, others that I draw on quite a bit, like Jacques Ellul or Ivan Illich, all understood something about this. And so really my work has just been, I see it as an effort to bring their insights to bear on contemporary situations, because I think it can be very illuminating.
Michael, one of the things you said in this liminal state that we're in was this notion that it's kind of an interregnum. The old is dying, but the new has not yet been born. Right. And you use the metaphor or the idea of two cities kind of overlapping on each other, people bumping into each other at the causeways of the city. Can you say more about that? Can you say more about this sort of the analog and the digital city and how they're overlapping?
Right. Yeah. This is my struggle has been to try to figure out a way of talking about this that will sort of make sense of this dynamic of the old and the new and how they interact. And at the time that I was preparing this article was initially a talk that I gave at Catholic University, and the imagery comes out of the writing of St. Augustine, who in the late Roman Empire was sort of trying to understand how this new institution, the church, fit into the existing body politic. And so one way of talking about that for him was to speak of the city of God and the city of man and how they interacted. And I certainly didn't mean to sort of equate either of those with digital or analog institutions, but that structure of two communities within the larger public sphere living and interacting together and working together, but bringing to bear very different assumptions upon how they conduct their life and how they see the world. That seems to me to be a good description of the present situation for us. In other words, we have a class of people who were brought up under analog conditions, pre-internet, pre-digital technology conditions, and so they have assumptions grounded in those pre-digital conditions. And then increasingly, a cadre of people in society who are truly, in some respects, native to the digital age. We might think of it as a digital age, which is a bit of a cliche, but the world as it has come to be characterized by digital media.
One of the examples you had that it just really struck me was a nice example was this notion of, the people who were raised in the societal structure of maybe thinking more analog or in that world would say, well, why don't we have more fact checkers? Why don't, clearly that's a lie. Why don't we have a fact checker? And you made the distinction that it's actually just, that's kind of a cute way of thinking almost. It's like adorable, but misses the point. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Right. Yeah. I think that it should be evident by now that more fact checking isn't the answer, and it sort of presumes the idea of the media consumer who is going to apply his critical thinking to a limited set of information that's presented to him or her and arrive at an informed judgment. And the underlying assumption there, I think, is still a situation where you're operating, number one, under conditions of relative information scarcity, and that the funnels of information are pretty well defined by mass media, say. One of the anchors on the 4 networks or one of the reigning newspapers. But we don't live under those conditions anymore. We live in the conditions of information superabundance. We don't depend upon these resources exclusively to get information to us. And so the idea that someone coming in and supplying you with an authoritative perspective or authoritative take on what is the truth here, I think misses the point of the way in which we've kind of balkanized into sort of siloed epistemological communities, epistemic communities, all taking in information and making sense of it and being able to draw on enormous amounts of information to weave narratives that are conducive to
that the abundance means we can do fact fitting. Like we could just fit a fact to match whatever we want because we have this abundance of information. There's plenty of facts. I'll find one, that'll fit. And fact fitting, versus truth, or fact checking.
Yeah, is that the people who behave digitally and analogically do not, for example, neatly fall into older and younger.
Right.
In that, if you look at where conspiracy theories live, or the alternative facts around vaccines, people who are behaving, I'm picking my own facts, I'm living in my own bubble. I'm kind of rejecting perhaps the more Enlightenment scientific approach to things. Those people could be anyone. They could be older Trump supporters. They could be younger anti-vaxxers. It's almost like the establishment or the most educated, steeped in Western thought are the ones who are left aghast, wondering what's going on. What's your sense for how that moves through society?
I don't know if this helps here, but after the article, I started to talk about this in terms of database and narrative, using those words, not necessarily with great precision, but to suggest that our experience of information under digital conditions is the experience of weaving our way through a database rather than receiving narratives. And so, as an example, when the events of January 6th were unfolding, I happened to have dipped into Twitter for a moment. And within 30 minutes, I had already been inundated with raw footage of what was happening on the ground, with multiple takes as to what is going on. But none of those amounted to a narrative telling me what was happening. They were rather an immersion in a database, or as some might more precisely call it, sort of a data lake. And so at that moment, the imperative is on me to sort of construct the narrative, to piece together what is happening, or to give up, in desperation of ever being able to piece together the narrative. And so I think the question is whether we are shaped by the experience of this database, or whether we are still accustomed to receiving our information in a prepackaged narrative format, already digested for us, and the relevant facts assembled for us, the irrelevant facts supposedly left out. And the differences between those who sort of are increasingly aware of the fact that what we are being given through traditional media outlets is a narrative, and that they find it increasingly difficult to sort of treat this narrative as an objective recitation of the facts, because they are already privy to the multiplicity of data points that have been left out by that narrative, which they then can sort of read as a function of bias or a function of prejudice, et cetera, et cetera. And so you don't have to be any age in particular to be subject to that. I think it depends in large degree to the degree which you've immersed yourself in the conditions of the database, or whether you still, primarily maybe pick up the Sunday paper and read through it as your way of ingesting information.
McLuhan talked about total involvement, acoustic space, being surrounded by this stuff. And it's interesting, particularly in our culture, where there is suspicion of mainstream media. The fact that you have all the stuff gives you all the more reason to say, see, the mainstream media is wrong because you're building your own narrative. And the fact that, particularly in American culture, we have this deeply individualistic thing that says, go find your own truth, or your research is okay. There seem to be elements in our society that make this work particularly in a particularly accelerated manner.
Right. It's almost as if the ideal of the informed citizen, who as a function of his responsible citizenship is going to make sense of things. And so if you carry that imperative into digital conditions, then it seems to me that one likely outcome is that you're just going to get a complete fracturing of understandings of reality and into smaller and smaller sort of niche groups. And so, Well,
there's a component of this too, though, that you make a point about that. I actually liked the fact that I didn't see it, being suddenly turned into a kind of a cliche demographic story. It's the older versus the younger, the blah blah blah. It was really about the mindset. But you make a really interesting point about those things that we felt united us as a society. Whether they were democratic beliefs, whether they were the belief in the citizen and the state and things like that, that those became hollow in this era of information abundance because there were so many different narratives. And you actually draw an interesting comparison back to the written word, and looking at this not as suddenly new, but actually as a spectrum from when we went from oral storytelling to the written word, and how even the written word forced you to be more aware, sort of have a metacognition that you're actually organizing words into a sentence onto a page. You're editing yourself. And that was when we began to edit ourselves. And I just found that to be really fascinating, because you mentioned in some senses it valorizes the individual right there versus the community. So that fracturing didn't just happen in the last 5 or 10 or 15 years. That fracturing, or that shifting, you can look at as something that has happened for a long time. And in each case, it has changed society. It has changed us. It's not just this plus that. It's a shifting of what we are. I wonder, where do you feel like you come out at the end of the article? Like, where do you, because there's a lot in there, and it really goes back in time and then comes forward and then kind of helps us kind of look at things in a new way. I found it to be very illuminating for me. But where do you come down at the end, or where do you come down at the kind of how do you look at this? How do you wrap it?
I don't, and I don't mean that facetiously. I honestly, a lot of what I'm trying to do is simply try to understand. One of the there's an interview McLuhan gives, and Andrew can probably speak to this in better detail, but he talks about simply trying to understand, right, to make sense of what is happening. And that itself is a kind of form of resistance to the transformations of the age. And so, for a long time, I've taken that as a way of thinking about what I'm trying to do. And in that article specifically, I'm well aware that these conditions are shifting, they're evolving. I have limited perspectives that I bring to bear on these situations and our changing dynamics. And so the fact that it was illuminating to you is about as good an end as I can hope for, honestly, because that's essentially what I'm aiming for. I have no sort of agenda as to where the point to which I want to bring this.
Yeah,
Michael,
yeah.
you put that piece to bed just before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then it really spoke to us because this pandemic has been about accelerating all these things, living more virtually, going through an entire election cycle when we are immersed in nothing but what everyone's saying. What have you learned? And as you kind of reread the article last night before today's talk, how do you frame this last pandemic year as a medium exercise?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's interesting because it has at its best, I think this past year has maybe reminded us of the value of embodied, maybe we might think of as sort of more analog interactions. We've been dumped into an almost exclusively digitized set of relations. This is more recently sort of the language I've wanted to use here. I even the language of the digital city and the analog city I've kind of walked away from to some degree because of the way that it uses the metaphor of a place and thus kind of treats digital life as something elsewhere, which I think feeds an unfortunate way of thinking about digital media. And so digitized relations, or our relations become digitized. Right now we're having an interaction, we're relating to one another. The body is present but not present. And that telepresent mode of life, I think, is ultimately, I would say this is one of the assumptions I do bring to bear, that as human beings, we long kind of for a fully embodied experience of the world. And these have been these opportunities that have arisen because of these digital tools like Zoom or this particular app that we're using at the moment have been fine. But I hope that it has reminded us of the value of the face-to-face encounter, for example, which for me is a value, a good that we ought to preserve. And so we've been further.
I wonder too.
Yeah.
This notion of the embodied self is very deep for me. I mean, I think this feels like I've talked to a lot of people who have gone out and walked in the forest more than they've ever walked before. Gone out and tried to do things, and partly it's been that they have the time to, but also that they're feeling so cooped up. And when we look at the cognitive science and the behavioral science around this, we know that there are sometimes upwards of 70% of our decisions are made by context each day. We call them zombie decisions, and this notion that our context is decisive. It actually decides for us. And when you think of the pandemic of the virus pandemic, you also, and I just recently saw an article about this, a pandemic of over-prescribing ADHD medication to kids because they can't do their homework. And the kids are blaming themselves, the parents are blaming themselves, the teachers are, but we're ignoring the fact that everyone is sitting in a bed Zoom all day long, and they're not getting that context shift to be embodied. They're not standing at the corner waiting for the bus. They're not sitting on the bus. They're not sitting in the schoolroom. They're not in the study hall. They're not walking. And then we expect everybody to be the same. Well, in my day, you do 3 hours of homework, but actually in your day, you had context helping you embody and shape those interactions. And we've had a context collapse in some ways that you said in your article that I just thought was delightful. It was sort of a triumph of shared time, but a demise of shared place. And I think that dichotomy was it just punched me in the gut when I saw that, because it just reminded me of the work I do around embodied learning and about how we actually grow.
Right, and I think that focus on the body is essential. Part of my own approach to these questions has been deeply informed by trying to make sense of what is happening to the body, what is not happening to the body. Even something like the experience of Zoom and this phenomenon of Zoom fatigue that we talk about so often. I've tried to understand that in terms of the fact that we are trying to make sense of our conversations, just make sort of literal cognitive sense of what one another is saying to each other, but without realizing it, extracting all of these cues that the body gives and as part of the meaning-making activity. Even now, in this dynamic of not being able to make eye contact with you, I can look into the camera, but if I do so, I lose your eyes, or your screen is just small enough where I can't see your eyes. And I think this takes a toll, and it's a function of the body. In other words, it misses what's important to recognize is that this is not just another way of talking. It is a different way of talking, and that it extracts certain elements of the fully embodied exchange or encounter. And so that, yes, it has consequences. The fact that we have been living ever more exclusively, the other sort of term that comes to mind is doom scrolling, right, where it became such a popular expression, neologism during the time of quarantine, that we're somehow trapped in these devices and we feel kind of compulsively engaged with them. And I think I would say the experience is one of losing our bearings, so to speak.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that the psychic consequences of that are certainly profound. And so that if we've realized that, if we've recognized that through this time, that's a good thing.
This feels like
and you remind me too of this notion of how do we have to learn how to curate ourselves in some weird way, which you talk about in the book as well. But there's the curation that has to happen just to stop us from doom scrolling. People have come up with joy scrolling and doom scrolling. It's sort of, what are you doing to joy scroll? Well, Saturday Night Live, like a week or two ago, had a fake commercial about Zillow, and it was really about like sort of just dreaming about the home that you'll have at some point, as a form of adult intimacy, just thinking and talking together about the home you'll have as a means of joy scrolling, and so you're almost curating every new aspect. I know, Peter, I think we want to get some more guests in.
Yes, I was going to.
How do we want to go from here?
Let's bring in Andrew McLuhan. Andrew, boy, your grandfather would have been fascinated by this last year.
He sure would.
We've spoken before, but I'd first just love to hear your take on this conversation, which really has been applying a lot of this. The way the message of a medium is its effect on us, and that's an awful lot of what we've been through here. So I'm kind of thrilled for you two guys to kind of meet.
It's a pleasure. We had hoped to meet before virtually, Michael, and I'm glad we have the opportunity now.
Likewise.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. I'm reminded of what T.S. Eliot said in the Four Quartets. We had the experience, but we missed the meaning. And I've recently been reading Eliot and the Four Quartets, and that's an interesting statement. You're right. The medium is the message, and the message is change. And that's what Michael was driving home in his article, Analog and Digital City. He said, digital media is reconfiguring our politics in a more fundamental level, reshaping the human experience at both an individual and social level. And that doesn't happen on the narrative level, but it happens structurally. And I think Michael did. When I came across the article, I kept reading it, waiting for him to quote McLuhan, and he never did. And it was funny because it was one of these cases where Marshall McLuhan's there in everything but name. And I ended up speaking with Michael, and he explained to me, as happens, editors get a hold of things and shape things, and they end up a little different than you started out. And names aside, the ideas are there, and that's really what's important. It was interesting you talking about this idea of navigating a database versus the narrative. And Peter kind of came up with the word acoustic space. One of these ideas, dichotomies that Marshall employed a lot were these ideas of acoustic and visual space. And I think this applies to what you're talking about with narrative versus database, where the narrative level, as you're using it, is more talking about the sequence, A to B to C to D, the way we talk about, cause and effect, the sequential, the visual, the linear, the connected. Whereas in a database and scrolling through things online, it's more about resonance, and this idea that things don't have connections, but resonances and relations between each other, which are a little more subtle than cause and effect. acoustic space, non-linear. And I think that is really the order of the day today, and that's been for quite a long time. But man, yeah, this last year, so much has changed. I mean, even your program, you've managed to fit 61 episodes into 52 weeks. So, I think it's actually that one little dig is really indicative of our experience of time, which has changed in that, it's speaking of cliches, people have been saying, man, this last year has been a decade, and it really feels like it's been an age. And what I've found very, very interesting from a media studies point of view is that we've lived through an order of change on the level of a major technology, like the switch into digital or the switch into print culture. But instead of a technology, the supposed agent of change was a virus, and cause and effect gets a little slippery in these days. But
Andrew, was that much more common, or Michael, was that much more common that it was an agents of change outside of us? The 1918 virus, the plague, etc. That these kind of deus ex machina or something, these things that happened from above were much more common, were they not? And it's just sort of, we felt much more in control in the last few decades, and this was an eye opener, or do you think it's something different? Like this is a different. I mean, each time it's different, I guess, but are we going to have more of these kind of externalities, or less, or maybe that's a dumb question. I don't know.
I mean, this was an externality that broke the dam of new technology, right? We'd been talking about working from home, and for a bunch of reasons, people had an orthodoxy that you all had to be in San Francisco, or it might not work that well. And this opened up the possibility you could recapture the real estate savings and people would like it more and live elsewhere. And there was a flip, right? And there was it was almost like all of this. We thought we'd been through the digital transformation with social media and the internet. Little did we know how much we were hanging on to something, and then we threw a bunch of it off, and now we'll see how much we go back.
Well, and I'm not convinced everybody, this whole like leaving San Francisco, leaving whatever the place is, or collapsing your business, down into a total virtual space. I'm not all convinced that all the pundits who are telling us this is the future realize maybe what Michael has been saying in his writings about, actually, no, we're in the interregnum. I don't think you can declare what it will be yet, because it is becoming born.
The pendulum has certainly swung one way, and I think it'll swing back to really equalize. But to Peter's point, the pandemic was really the catalyst, the push to do things which were possibilities or promises that hadn't yet been realized, and this situation forced them to. So it's been, the idea of working from home has been out there for quite a long time, but because it wasn't mandatory, it didn't become a reality. And this is the main difference between the pandemic, a pandemic in the early 19th or 20th century versus today, because we were ready to jump in with our whole bodies through the screen, as it were. And that's really made all the difference. Like, all scrolling is doom scrolling, really.
Right.
And Zoom fatigue, well, it turns out that it's not the same thing to sit in front of a screen for 3 hours as it is to sit in front of a lecture or a class or anything else. They're completely different experiences. And this is why, this Eliot line, we had the experience, but we missed the meaning, keeps coming back to me. And I think people are really waking up to this. What gives me hope for our futures in times like these, and I think Marshall saw this coming, is it's speed and the scale of change are at once a blessing and curse. They're a curse because, man, it's making us with our nerves exposed to our bodies and anxieties through the roof, and nobody's sleeping and we can't concentrate. But on the other hand, we don't have time to adjust. So we have a shot at understanding and seeing what's happening. And that makes us able to understand our situation a lot more. And I think that's a real bonus and a silver lining, if there is one. There's that line somebody said, if they only raised the bathwater a half a degree an hour, we wouldn't know when to scream. Well, we're jumping right into the boiling pot with this stuff, and it's obvious, and as hard as that is, it's I think it's also hopefully a catalyst to us to do something about it and not just say, oh, this sucks.
Michael, at the end of your article, you said the Promethean aspiration meets sober assessment, and we're chastened about the limits of human flourishing. I thought that was really, it relates exactly to what Andrew just said. We're thrown into it, and it's sort of almost humbling to realize the limits of this, to realize the kind of possibilities and limits.
McLuhan often said it took an outsider to look at a society to see how it's being changed. Perhaps what we're saying here is it's actually happening fast enough that we might all see it if we look. And on that note, we always have a dead guest on our show, and your grandfather has very kindly consented to come back and share some thoughts on that. So can we play clip 1, please?
I come from a 19th century country, Canada, and this gives me a great advantage in looking at the 20th century.
The 20th century is the age of electric technology. It's the most dominant tool of our time. It is causing you to reconsider and reevaluate every thought and every institution you formerly took for granted.
I know exactly where the boundaries of the 20th century begin. Mostly they begin in the United States. So any Canadian can see what you cannot see. That is, you live in the 20th century, more or less, and it becomes therefore invisible.
The electric age is changing you. It is changing your family. It is changing your neighborhood. It's changing your education. It's changing your job. When this circuit learns your job, what are you going to do? It's changing your government. It's changing your relationship to others. These little circuits are making our world go. The electric age is having a profound effect on us. We are in a period of fantastic change that's coming about at fantastic speed. Your life is changing dramatically, and you are numb to it.
Yeah. Why I think Marshall McLuhan remains relevant, and not only relevant but vital, is because he wasn't so much commenting on his time as commenting on the effects of human technologies and innovations. And the lessons that he teaches are therefore relevant to any technological situation.
We have another guest. Why don't we have David join us? So David, welcome. You and I met after you had written your first book, Revenge of the Analog, that you and I were both doing a lot of work in the maker movement, and so was Mickey at the time, right? So that was about 2016. It was the time when in Silicon Valley we're thinking we're over-indexing for code, not as much for making things, not that, we have tools to make things, but we're all thinking about code. You were looking at it in terms of almost the nostalgia for analog records and such. Fast forward to today, you've begun work on kind of a sequel. What does it mean as to the world that we're in? And that's what we've been talking about this hour. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are from a student of analog and having listened to our conversation today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be joining you from 19th century Canada, in the sense that Andrew and I are still waiting for vaccines for the next 6 months at least. what I've been thinking about over the course of the year is really the future, right? What the digital age, if you want to call it that, or Silicon Valley, or just the past several decades have shown to us, very similar to that great video of Marshall McLuhan, that the film that we saw, is this sense of inevitability of what the future would look like. The inevitability was that as computers got more powerful, as the internet became more pervasive, as artificial intelligence and big data and name your buzzword of the week got more prevalent, the future would be wonderfully enabled by this technology to do all sorts of things. We could work anywhere, we could go to school anywhere. If you want to eat the most delicious food from the best restaurant, just tap a device and it'll arrive at your door in 20 minutes. Well, 51 weeks ago, that future arrived, whether we wanted it or not, and we were all thrown into the bath, as Andrew said. There have been parts of it that have been okay. There have been parts of it that have been horrendous and terrible. There have been parts of it that in many of our lives or where we work or institutions have actually been an improvement. So as we come out of it, as the vaccines roll out and get into arms and the pandemic fades into the background and life resumes its ability to resume as normal, what does the future look like? And I'm interested in that in the perspective of the value of analog in our lives, because we've done without, for the sake of life and safety and health and keeping people alive, right? We closed down stores, we closed down restaurants, we closed down schools. We brought all those things into this screen out of a sense of emergency and necessity. And yes, now we see, well, we could theoretically do this and continue along this track, make improvements, improve the technology, do it some way. But do we want to? Or what are the parts of it that we want to actually bring with us into the future? And what are the parts we've realized it doesn't improve our lives? In fact, as Michael wrote, in some sense, it makes it worse. It makes it more chaotic. It makes it more unequal. It makes it more fascistic, I guess, to use the term of the day. And so what I'm interested in is, the bathtub metaphor is a great one. What we've actually undergone over the past year is an experiment, right? The world of technology, the world of digital, the world of Silicon Valley. This is it. A/B testing. We had A, here's B for the past year. What worked better? What worked better in our lives? What worked better with our friendships? What worked better with our social life? What worked better with school? What worked better with work? What worked better with the office? What worked better with the way we want to shop or see art or absorb culture, or the way we're going to build our lives in communities and cities? We actually can now compare that and contrast that. And instead of saying, no, this is the future because this is it, AI is coming, this is the future, the reality is we get to choose the future we want to build. We shape it. And there's nothing that's predestined about that.
It's a weird time. You also reminded me, Peter, of the maker movement, and you and David were working on this. But I'm noticing too that, there's the digital that we think of as the screen, but we're also getting to this point of being able to have things that surround us in the physical world that have their own opinions, that have their own goals, that have their own intentionality. Whether it's the speaker over there or whether it's something else, that we're actually starting to be surrounded by things that are willful. And these things are in the physical world. And in fact, a whole generation of kids have grown up learning how to do things like 3D print them and make things and wire circuit boards together in Tinkercad and make a little robot and do stuff like that. And it gives us a sense of control sometimes because, wow, I made that thing. But it also maybe, means that more of our world is waking up. More of our world is actually going to shape us through its intention, its analog context, its ability to immerse us. The Amazon Go store, we had Ashley Earhart, who was the head of the experience design of that. She spent 3 years building the Amazon Go store as a robot you walked into. It has cameras. It knows if you're dragging your left leg, which means you might have had congestive heart failure. It knows if that thing you're holding is reflected and it should charge you twice, or as once, because reflections are not like actually the thing you're holding. So what happens to us when things wake up, when places wake up, and the analog starts to have its own intentionality and its own direction? I mean, I feel like we can shape it, but can we shape it when so many other things are starting to be able to have the ability to shape us?
Of course we can. And I think, this is perhaps a bias of someone like yourself, and I'm not blaming you. I'm saying living in that world, right? Living in a world where the people you encounter are the people who are inventing these things, that you're constantly having conversations with those on the cutting edge of building the next store or augmented reality or blockchain, that in the same way that Michael is talking about groups on Facebook talking about QAnon conspiracy theories and seeing only that version of reality, the more you talk to people about that world, it's like some room on Clubhouse where everyone's like, yeah, Bitcoin's going to 3 million. Everyone's like, bro, I hear you, bro. Clubhouse, the social network for people without children, because every conversation happens at 6 p.m. But then walk out into the city and walk out into the reality of where you live, whether you're in Toronto like me, or Florida like Michael, or San Francisco like yourself and Peter, and see that, yes, there are cameras that might have sensors, and there are augmented devices, and you're talking about some potential future, but you actually have to address the reality that you're living in. And the reality of the environment that you're in is that, yes, is there a potential that these things will have greater importance? Sure. But what are the other things that we've realized the importance of this year? So you talked about your friends going for walks. I was talking to friends of mine in the Bay Area the other day. All they talked to me about was how much hiking they've done, right? Or I've taken up surfing here in Toronto, which is a truly idiotic pursuit because there's no ocean.
Wow.
Parks have taken on a greater meaning, right? These things that we're saying, well, okay, yes, that technology is going to change that, it's going to augment it, and when you're surfing next time, there's going to be a robot that pushes you into a wave, and sure, maybe that's coming, maybe that's happening, but I'm trying to reflect a future where I'm seeing the things that I actually value, and that's reflecting the current reality that there is. So the reality, and this is the sort of base reality, and not this far off science fiction reality, is like, we are analog creatures. We are flesh and blood biological beings, and we live on a spinning rock that's hurtling through space. And no matter how much Yuval Harari I read that says we're going to, transcend that and enter some sort of singularity, that's the reality that I believe in, and is going to be dominant for quite some time.
David, one of the points that McLuhan often made was that we turn our past into almost a form of art. I think he quoted Edmund Carpenter once saying that the natives had no art, they did everything the best that they could. And it strikes me that we may have a new relationship to the analog. For example, there's a lot of conversation now that people will go back to the workplace, but it's more going to be about events, about getting together. People miss getting together in the water cooler. They don't really miss putting their headphones on and doing the work, which they could do from anywhere. There's a lot of talk that that as events come back, they'll be more holy, in the sense that we all flew around, or I flew around the world, went to a lot of conferences to go listen to stuff. Well, maybe the run-of-the-mill stuff is on Zoom, but when I go, it has to be a great experience. And so what this would suggest is we take analog less for granted, and we elevate it. I'm not sure if the word is an art form, but we treat it differently. And Omid, maybe you can show that tweet that I just sent. Marketers are beginning to think, what are post-pandemic sensibilities going to look like? And there was an ad that ran this week for Suit Supply Company.
Oh God, yeah.
Okay, well, wait, let's go show it because everyone hasn't seen it. But basically, in this ad, everybody is making out and kissing and contacting each other. And the point here is, and by the way, this has been a prediction, right? People have talked about the fact that it was not an accident. There's this, you can scroll down, we see more of that. It was perhaps not an accident that after the pandemic in 1918, the Roaring Twenties and flappers and misbehaving and liberation came. And are we about to enter an era where we actually throw off even more Victorian values and become more hedonistic or more sensual? Or or not. But it does strike me that just as there are different levers in media that have to do with community and immediacy and the speed at which we look at stuff, there are levers of how we will reinterpret things analog that will come back, but they'll look a little bit different. I'm wondering about thoughts on that.
Yeah, Marshall talked a lot about obsolescence, and what happens when a new technology comes along is that it changes the meaning of the old technologies. It's one of what he called the laws of media. And it generally turns the thing that's just been taken over from into an art form. The thing about obsolescence and the way Marshall used the term is that it doesn't mean that this thing is going away. It just means that it's got a new role to play. And that's the point of that. I really appreciate what David said. And I didn't realize you're in Toronto. I'm just a couple hours east of you in Prince Edward County. Cutting edge is great, but the operative word there is cutting, And, you gotta be careful of that. The thing is, it's great to talk about what things do, but our history hasn't demonstrated that we're all that concerned with what things actually end up doing. And it's the side effects that tend to get us, I think about a commercial for a pharmaceutical. And you see these people frolicking through the fields, and this is what the drug enables you to do. Well, in the background, you've got a guy talking a mile a minute about all the stuff that's going to happen to you while you're busy frolicking through the fields.
You may lose your arm. You might have a third arm. We don't really know what'll happen. Beware
effects.
If you actually have eyeballs.
Right?
There's an interesting angle here, though, in this the obsolescence. Some companies have actually built their entire. Many companies probably have built their entire company on withered technology. If you look at Gunpei, what's his last name? He's the inventor of Nintendo, and his entire philosophy, and all Nintendo has always been this way. And whenever they come out with a new platform, people are like, it's got an old chip in it. His theory is lateral thinking with withered technology. Gunpei Yokoi. And their entire philosophy before they were a game company was taking withered technology and using lateral thinking to come up with wildly new things. That's why the Wii, which everyone was like, that's got an old chip in it, it's got this whole thing. But actually it was this withered technology of actually motion tracking that it suddenly allowed 90-year-olds to have bowling tournaments, and suddenly they could do things. And so I'm very interested in how we do have this perception that technology leaves us, but it doesn't. It actually is raw material for us for this other thing that can happen. I think, David, you do quite a lot of exploration of this with the rise of the record players and things like that.
I actually, that Marshall McLuhan quote about changing the meaning of the new technology in the beginning of the Revenge of Analog book. I think about, let's not think about a digital analog technology, but other advances of technology. The automobile, right? The great, I would say probably, prior to digital computing, the most impactful invention of the past century. Completely transformed our world for good in some ways and for bad in some ways of the era of climate change that we're now living in, car accidents, the way that cities have been designed. And so, one of the interesting things that has really come out over the past year, as many of us have seen in our communities, is the explosion of bicycles. You couldn't buy a bicycle last summer. I remember driving by a store here in Toronto. I was like, are they giving away vaccines? It was like a lineup of 100 people. They were lined up to buy bicycles. The city opened up, every city opened up, closed down roads, opened it up for biking. Bike traffic increased tremendously around the world. When you think about the biggest advances in urban living and the future of cities over the past 20 years, it hasn't been digital sensors and augmented reality and AI and many of these digital technologies that were promised. It was bike lanes, right? New York City installed 500 miles of bike lanes, cities like Zurich and Copenhagen and all those beautiful European cities.
The sort of cyclovia movement, which came to Toronto a while ago,
which is with what is it, an 18th century technology or earlier? The bikes, my dad goes and buys $20,000 carbon fiber bikes. Sure, that's changed, but the average bike that you're buying is, a bunch of metal and some rubber. So one of the things that came out of that is like the examination of these two different technologies and getting back to that A/B testing and saying, okay, well, we've seen what cars have done. We've seen how they transform our cities. Let me now reevaluate this thing. This was newer. This was better. All of a sudden, you know, this one has taken on this new value. And so I think after this, the value of the office, which we saw as inefficient and expensive and annoying, and, you know, a lot of real estate and a lot of space, and you had to go there and it involved commuting. All of a sudden, people are going to go back to it and they're going to say, wow, actually, those things are true, but the value of those things is tremendous. Like on the other side of my wall here, here is my neighbor, Lauren. She works for the Canadian Pension Plan. So one day when Andrew and I retire, you know, hopefully we got some money. She's an investment person. She flew all around the world investing in, you know, the pension plan and in venture capital funds in Silicon Valley, Hong Kong, London. She was on a plane every other week, you know, going to the office. She sits in that place on a Zoom call every day from like 9 to 6. If it's a nice day, I was like, oh, have you gotten outside? Nope, can't leave it, can't go down for 5 minutes. She said, I am dying to get back to the office, like absolutely dying to get back to the office. And she doesn't care if it's the office is crappy and she has to commute there on a streetcar and, you know, it's expensive and the chair isn't as good as the chair she has at home. She gets to see people. She gets to be with people. She gets to stay out of her space. I mean, you know, again, when we describe this idealized future, you could work from home and you could go to school from home and you could order all the food you want from anywhere from home. Anything you want in the world, it will be delivered to your front door. But what we didn't say is, but you're going to be stuck at home all effing year, all effing year with your kids keep wanting in your house with you.
I want to do an episode of Quarantine where it's just our feet. It's not our faces, you know, because that's one of the things I miss going to an office is seeing the amazing, you know, just socks that somebody decided to wear today.
I've been wearing these slippers, slippers and sweatpants.
Have you worn a shoe in the last 6 months? Yeah. But I do think we're missing all that. And Michael, you mentioned this. It's just that embodied nature. It's the other person that we're missing too of that embodied. That high bandwidth has been collapsed down to like a click stream. And I do wonder, though, if hedonistic adaptation implies that, you know, which we know is a fairly, I mean, it's why people who are wealthy are not any happier because they basically have hedonistic adaptation. They kind of can't have enough. If we will cherish and love those bike lanes and getting back to the office and the concerts and those things for a while and then forget how much we did value it. You know, because it's a friction and there's friction involved. And, you know, how do we make sure that we remember this? Because it's the experiences that we're having right now. We're going to look back as halcyon days, even if we've lost our family members and because so much happens so fast, that acceleration.
I think there's elements of it.
What's going to happen? Yeah.
Well, I think there's elements of it, of course, you know, the time with family, it's forced that those analog interactions we've had with people, a walk with a friend outside wearing a mask, like that, those have really been elevated. You know, you mentioned friction, and friction is seen in software development as a negative, right? As something to be a problem to be solved. But friction creates heat. Friction creates fire.
Important. Yeah.
Friction is, you know, there's no babies without friction. Sorry, science class. And
I think that's the quote for this episode. Apparently, let's just change the title. We're done. Yeah.
Friction
Peter left us because he's going to go make a big poster put on the side. Michael, we haven't heard from you in a little bit.
As long as it's as good as that title sequence.
I'm curious about what your reactions are to some of David's comments and Andrew's.
Yeah, and I apologize. My feed was a little weak, and so I was hesitant to jump in, but I think it seems to have cleared up right now. This is interesting. You know, I mentioned, you know, Marshall McLuhan has certainly been very influential. Ivan Illich, a 20th century social critic who wore many hats and wrote some pretty stinging critiques of industrial society, also looms large as well. And it occurs to me too that, you know, this idea of what we have now and what we had before sort of also maybe obscures the possibility of something altogether different. so that the disorders of industrial society now may seem sort of appealing, right? So the enemy of the office, all of a sudden, because it brought us face to face with people, seems better than the despair of Zoom all day Zoom. But is there something an alternative to that, right? To both of those things.
Yeah.
And I was hopeful that we would not only become nostalgic because of the conditions we were experiencing in quarantine, but that we might take it as an opportunity to think anew about what new configurations of social life might look like. And as to that question, I think, Mickey, about hedonistic adaptation, it's a matter of what assumptions we will continue to work with. It is interesting that modernity to some degree is driven, I think, by a desire for control, to control nature, eventually to control the social order. We don't like to be out of control. A very mundane example of this that I've cited recently is that we prefer to text than to talk by phone because we can control the text interaction better. We have a latent impulse to control and to think that happiness lies on the other side of more and more control. We have more data about our body. If we can measure it, then we feel that we can achieve a better life because of that, and we multiply this across the social order. If we continue to bring those desires into whatever follows this current pandemic situation that we're in, or circumstances, or also if we continue to operate under the logic of escalation, as Illich called it, which is that more is always better, and that the path towards happiness is again simply the accumulation of stuff, of better features, of better devices. If those assumptions carry over, then I think we'll find ourselves in much the same place as we were before. The question is whether we have realized that limits sometimes become the conditions of joy and satisfaction and happiness, rather than obstacles to always be transcended and transgressed. That's a fundamental question that I think we ought to.
Well, it reminds me of Stoicism and the book "The Obstacle Is the Way" and that notion of or even Carol Dweck's work on the struggle is when you're learning. That notion of growth mindset is actually about celebrating the struggle. It's not about you got a degree. But I love that thought. I mean, this notion of how do we move past the logic of escalation. I also think what's happened that's hidden beneath all this stuff is that the lack of a liberal arts education in some ways. I don't want to go too far onto this rant, but the lack of this sort of depth that Michael, you're talking about, that Andrew, that David, you're all looking at in the people who write our code has led to not only algorithms of oppression and making unlucky people unluckier, as Kathy O'Neill might say, but has also meant that we haven't built into our substrate of these social networks, or into the substrate of these things like pro-social theory that we actually know from evolutionary science actually leads to things, and from Elinor Ostrom leads to like actually well-formed groups that have autonomy, that actually do things. We haven't built that into any of our media in terms of this underlying platform. And so when we see something like Twitter or Facebook, strip mining our cognition and depleting our natural resources, and we have no FDA for our mind, we think that might be the only way social media could be or could have been. And I'm not convinced that's true. I think there are a vast number of pathways we haven't taken. And that kind of almost path dependency and inertia of the way we did take it makes it harder for us to see that we could actually go back or try a different path.
Early on in the pandemic, we talked about the fact that this ought to be a very plastic moment, that it was clearly a time that there was disruption and we could put in intentional design, right? And we knew, look, here, the issues of inequality are front and center. The environmental thing, there's 15 years to solve something there. The balance between office and home is changing. We have to give people more, find out ways to move housing, right? So there was this moment or this opportunity for experimentation, trying things, reducing rules. And one of the questions is, can we cruise into that? You and I have talked about reducing zoning rules in cities for experimentation. Or are we somehow getting back to an orthodoxy where the Republicans do their thing, the Democrats do their things, city rules do their things, and we forget about it in 10 minutes? Like, and this is kind of an interesting historical question, do we use moments like this to change, or do we use moments like this to not be willful about what we're going to change?
And I think it's, the question of Balaz I touched in the chat, but is one of progress, right? What is the true nature of progress? Is progress this, adherent to Moore's law, this inexorable march upward in one direction? Sorry, it's very hard to do this with these two things. You know what I'm saying, right? Moore's law. No, progress is two steps forward and one step backward, and we see that in the 20th century with the world wars and the Cold War and all these things where we thought, okay, well, we're just going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to get there, and once you can invent that, and every solution creates a new set of problems. The internet, social media is one that we're dealing with now, and so I think we're doomed if we don't take this moment to actually start looking at the experience that we've had and learning from it and asking the hard questions of, is this the best for us? Yes, we can do it. Or yes, it makes certain people and certain investors a lot of money, but is this actually, the best thing for us? Is this in our best interests as an individual or a family or a company or a society? And I think that the good thing about this year is that we've had this pretty unambiguous experience with it. We have been thrown into the boiling bathtub, and do you like a really hot bath, or is it too hot? You can answer that pretty easily.
But this makes me think, though, that there's this, we could have an age of intentionality where we actually have to be more humble, as Michael said, and really try to understand what human flourishing could be. But it's also exhausting. I mean, plastic moments feel exhausting. I don't want to be intentional about everything. I want to live. There's even when I hear people say OKRs and just all this stuff around goal-directed stuff in work. I just want to roll my eyes sometimes. I just want to point and say, maybe I want to wander over there, but I don't want to I just want directionality. Maybe I don't want to have to signal my intention for everything. And I just wonder, how do we balance this exhaustion of being in a plastic moment and trying to be more intentional with a good goal? I mean, I actually am fascinated by this notion of, could we be more humbly intentional?
Mickey, funnily enough, I keep getting more and more positive about our prospects. Each sea change of technology is a new opportunity to get it right. And I think we're so often disappointed in ourselves and how we manage to have opportunities but not quite live up to them. But I think we're in kind of a unique time, and things, the more power is decentralized, the harder it is for the established power holders, the harder it is for them to maintain control. Yeah. And they're the ones who are invested in keeping things the same. So the more distributed, if you like, the decision-making and power and the actual causes of change gets, I think the more possibilities we have to change things for the better. And of course, for the better is very subjective. But I think more and more we can agree on things which matter. Things like being with the people we care about, and actually being with people, and the natures of relationships and things. And the liberal arts education, which is truly a great thing, hasn't always made for the best outcomes either. So I'm not sure how much that's going to help us. But I do have some hope for that. It's interesting. We went from the age of literacy to post-literacy, and Marshall had said that it could turn out that the literate age was but a footnote in history. I think we have a real shot at reliteracy, and that is bringing back all the things that we valued from literacy, which are things like reason and logic and critical thinking skills, which you don't need moderators and fact checkers if people know how to do these things themselves and are capable of discerning truth from lies.
I would love to hear, Michael. This is an interesting point because you're suggesting we could enter a new age of reason through an abundance of information. We have the capacity. And Michael points out that as we went to a surfeit of information and we lost curators, we went the other way. This is a fundamental question about progress here. Michael?
Yeah, I think my sense is that the superabundance of information, if we give ourselves over to it, if we don't develop a kind of new set of aesthetic practices with regards to media, it's impossible for me to adjudicate every controversial issue that my Twitter feed throws at me every day, regardless of how well trained or how well educated I may be. So I default to my sort of communal understanding, whatever sort of group I belong to, the stance that they take, that becomes my reflexive stance to the issue, because it's the only way to cope, to manage with the situation. And so I guess on that score, I'm less optimistic. If we retain the ideal of keeping up with everything, immersing ourselves in global networks of, inundating ourselves with not only information overload, but affect overload. This goes to the exhaustion, I think, that we all feel. I think, the giving ourselves our digital media feeds in this way, the arc of digital media bends towards exhaustion, cognitive, emotional, et cetera. And I want to say, too, one question I've been meaning to raise here is the question of the we. Who is the we that we keep referencing, right? What community makes these choices with regards to the kinds of innovation that we allow into society or that is possible? And I think part of our problem is that there is no we. There is no collective we when we speak in this way. And the more global the problem, the harder the challenge of finding the we that will act. So I think that's an important a point to consider when we think about, will we take this opportunity or not? And
who is
and
we?
And it's complicated by the fact that to the degree that the we becomes the we of social media, right? The we that if we immerse ourselves into the media landscape that social media gives to us, then it becomes even harder to, I think, achieve any kind of consensus or to move productively forward in any direction, because the tendency of that medium, I think, is to splinter. And so we're longing for a we want a we, and the tools I think we have at our disposal right now to generate it tend to function against that desire, to undermine that desire. And so we go off into our Discord chats to find a measure of
part of what you're talking about is the need for a share of shared values or even values as we bring it to this system. And there's an interesting anecdote that comes to mind. I was on Facebook and a friend reposted John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace from the early 90s, in which Barlow basically made the distributed point that Andrew made, which is it was like, citizens of the world, we control cyberspace. We will not be taken over by states. It is an individual medium. We have a voice. We will not be subjugated. It was a very libertarian U.S. kind of argument. And it was very utopian, because if we've watched what's going on with the internet in China or Myanmar or North Korea, it turns out you could take over the internet and put up firewalls and cut cables. And even as we've seen in this country, you can get huge conversations about who's in charge of the conversation. And so what this points out is we've documented how optimistic we were and what went wrong. Separately, Barlow also posted at around the same time a completely different document.
Wait, have we had John Perry Barlow on our show yet, Peter?
We will get John on the show, but I'm not going to bring him right now because I'm reading you something. But I'll tell you about that in a moment.
He's passed away, but we should at least have him as a dead guest.
John keynoted a seminar, a thing I did on blockchain and cities about 8 years ago. So we have a lot of content. But here's what I wanted to point about Barlow. Right when he does the complete cyberspace independence, libertarian, individual self, Wyoming guy thing, he writes another thing: how to be an adult. Be patient. Don't badmouth. Assign responsibility, not blame. Never assume the motives of others are to them less noble. Expand your sense of the possible. Don't trouble yourself with matters you can't change. Tolerate ambiguity. expect more of other people than you can deliver yourself. Now, it strikes me that should have been the preamble to the Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace that would give us some sense for how to behave, but we left that part out. And it's a value system thing. Did print come with a new value system? I mean, we print challenged a value system. It brought in linearity and reason. Are we losing that?
We lost it a long time ago. Really. And Michael made this point in his article that the new technology is a new value system. And I think we've seen that shift again in the last year, that what we value and what value means changed big time. You know, it's funny to think that people are now looking back fondly on going to the office, right? And it makes you wonder if a few years down the road, we'll look back fondly on these halcyon Zoom days, right? But the fact is that Zoom made a lot of things. It's really interesting, actually. The pandemic came along at a weird time for me because it made possible this extended. Actually, the reason I'm here today was because I offered a course on understanding media, Marshall McLuhan's 1964 book. And that was made possible essentially by Zoom and by Gray Area in San Francisco. And through that, I've met a lot. You know, there are about 40 people in the class. And where I live in rural Southern Ontario, if I offered the class here, 12 weeks, essentially 36 hours examining 7 chapters of understanding media, I'd be talking to myself for 36 hours because nobody's signing up for that here, you know. But because of the pandemic, people had a couple extra hours a week. And because of Zoom, we were able to make it work. And so, you know, we have affordances and, you know, there's ups and downs. But yeah, it's it is hard to imagine looking back wistfully on these times, but to the point, certainly our values have changed, and it really wakes us up to what we value and prioritize. And those.
There's a weird mismatch too, though, temporally. You know, between you know, recently I was talking to somebody who's building a big hospital system in Canada, and you know, it'll take them 5 years to do all the regulatory code, to map all the things, to kind of get all the things, and then it'll take them about 2 years to build the campus. And the pace of time that happens with those things probably doesn't necessarily match between the analog and the digital city, and so we'll end up with infrastructure in the physical world that maybe mismatches the way that we want to live our life, and the investment, the sunk cost, the capital is going to make it very hard for us to do something about it. You know, with the cyclovia movement, the bicycle movement, I can't remember her name, Sadiq Khan in New York, who did this. Started with, she started with buckets of paint and chairs from Home Depot and potted plants to basically like take over parts of the city streets, because she found a loophole in the law about being able to pilot things without getting a bunch of approvals. And it allowed her to like make something amazing happen where the voters later voted for that change. But, you know, how much are we going to have to be kind of hacktivists in this world if we actually do find a better path and have to like kind of retrofit reality to match the different timescales, the pace layering, as maybe Stuart Brand would call it, between these different things?
Well, you know, that's a really interesting thing that you bring up. And that's the change in our experience of space due to COVID and the pandemic. And it's coming into play going forward with how we imagine architectural spaces, because, you know, nothing is quite so permanent as a temporary measure, you know. These habits, these things quickly become habits, which become the way we do things. So, you know, they talk these temporary measures where people put stickers on the floor to let you know how far to stay away from people. This is the new way of our experience with physical space and how to treat each other in public. And it's, I think, a third from acoustic to visual to a pandemic space, a COVID space, and it's a really interesting and large subject. It's affect the way, I'm very lucky because I live in this rural area and we have a couple of acres and I've got a house and then a library barn and then a big barn. So I have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to
Wait, a library barn?
Yeah, this is a 2-story barn, which is my father's now my library and archive. So
you've upgraded your internet. When you taught the course,
I
you
am
weren't able to do it from the library.
jealous.
I know. No, listen. I got really lucky when I taught the course. I had to rent an office in nearby Wellington, but a neighbor behind me actually paid to put a 50-foot tower up the back of my barn to get line of sight internet. So now I can broadcast from the library. This is my.
Can we make library barns a thing? Could we just do that? Could we make that like the thing? Because come on.
I know. I'm sorry. Sorry.
I love that.
Sorry.
Damn. Yeah, I know. Nothing is quite so permanent as a temporary measure. I just like that turn of a phrase. I need to think about that. In terms of, I think, Peter, when you were doing prototype market or market prototype, that was kind of the part of it. You wanted activists and artists to prototype something and use a loophole in the law that was festival prototypes. Like festivals could do things to city streets that normally couldn't be done, but it was your way of kind of hacking the city department, the code of the city with the citizens. I don't know, that just seems like an interesting space to explore.
Well, marketers and advertisers know it very well, and this is why you get free samples. Try it for a week and see how you like it. And this is why.
Okay, I didn't think of it that way.
To subscribe for something, put in your credit card. The first month is free, and you can cancel at any time.
It's a little bit like the Roach Motel design pattern,
By the way,
right?
this is why
that Facebook uses or health clubs use. You can check in anytime you want. It's very hard to leave.
You can never leave.
This gets us a little bit to McLuhan's very special place for the artist who was trying things and imagining things and playing with the future because he wasn't on a task. He was just evolving and playing. In fact, I believe we have the late Professor Marshall McLuhan speaking about art. Omid, if you can play the last clip, the clip about McLuhan and art, it's very relevant to this conversation.
Chances of your understanding anything going on in your own time are very small, except through the means or media provided by artists. Artists are people who enjoy living in the present.
Since the time of the Renaissance, we have been contained by a visual monopoly. Art was rigid and kept us out of the frame. Today, art is anything you can get away with.
My own way of testing the sorts of effects that any new form is likely to have on us is to keep a sharp lookout on changing styles in the arts. The artist is always a jump ahead of technology and is engaged really in giving you images of what sort of effects it's likely to have upon you later on. The effect of the electric revolution is to create once more an involvement that is total.
Anyway, it was the artist would see what's next. He was a distant early warning was what he would call it. Oh, I think you're muted, Andrew.
There we go. This is something that Marshall kind of borrowed from Ezra Pound. And as it happens, I have the book in front of me here, The ABC of Reading. And this actually is, here, let me show it for the people at home. There's Marshall's signature up there. This is one of Marshall's copies. And it's here on page 81 that Ezra Pound says, the artist is the antenna of the race.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is actually one of the delights of this library is I can follow Marshall's thoughts as he reads this book.
Yeah, I remember in our past episode, you shared with us that he annotated stuff so much that it's like wandering through just a wonderland. of certain books. I think what the James Joyce comment you made was stunning as well. Just the fact that I would not have made that connection, but
well, it's so wonderful. And actually, funnily enough, I was talking about this earlier, but reading an annotated work, a work annotated by Marshall or my father Eric, for me, is almost like it's reading it with them, and just seeing. It's as if they pause every few paragraphs to say, well, what that reminds me of, because they made a note of it here. And so it's such a wonderful thing. And I'm surrounded by this annotated library.
But isn't it funny that we lost that with an iBook? Like, you can't take an iBook up and have the author sign it. You can't, put and oh, by the way, you can only have a bookshelf with iBooks. If you want to have Kindles, you actually have to buy a different bookshelf. A virtual bookshelf, and we lost that. We can't actually pick up a book from here and put it over there. But we never saw that we lost it. It was a strange thing.
But this is
they just lost those affordances.
But this is something that I chronicled.
So there's give and takes.
Yeah, but this is something that I chronicled in the last book that I wrote. The ebook has been out for 15 years or so. The Kindle, I think, came in 2007. It was widely predicted to do to the publishing business and books what the MP3 and streaming did to music. And, to this day, I had a book come out last year. 1 out of 10 copies are digital, right? The publishing business and the book business and the short business have done fine. They've actually been growing. Why? Because people were presented with the future that have been working on for years. And they assessed it, and they realized that they actually like to write in a book, and they like to buy books that had Marshall McLuhan's signature, and like the feel of it, and they liked the look of the books behind their head, and not just because they were entering some dystopian future where bookshelves behind your head would be the highest form of social capital. Apparently,
but I think also when we did before the pandemic, we had this ability to, like, when we went to somebody's house for dinner, or entertainment, a family house or something, you could see what it was, an externalization of what they were curious about, and you could be like, "Oh my gosh, you have that book? I have that book."
You're into sustaining life. You're into sustaining life.
Wow.
Michael's into Plato. Andrew's into everything.
But that externalization was so beautiful, right? And of course, it became a cliche during Zoom because everybody was like, "Oh crap, we're sitting in front of something."
In a year, when you go to someone's house for dinner, that value has not gone away. And if anything,
I'm going to look for those books and those records and those other things.
There's no more illicit. For me, there's no more illicit thrill than when I go to someone's house to drop something off, and I peek in the doorway. It's like, getting a peek of like a brassiere when you're a teenager. Teenagers use the word brassiere a lot. But it's, it's like this, oh, look at that forbidden world, someone else's house. Like, one day I'll be able to go and flip through their bookshelves and eat their food.
There was also the real crazy value of being able to gift somebody a book that you read that you really felt strongly about. At my old lab, Maya, we had a bookshelf of please take these books. And it was sort of really interesting. And you could actually tell the ebb and flow of Mayans. Like, oh, we've gotten a lot more cognitive psychologists lately. Look at the weird books they're giving away versus, oh, we've gotten more engineers. Look at all the science fiction books, or look at all the whatever. And it was a fun way that, like, people would bring a bag of books in, and it was this joy of, oh man. Or you might even leave a book on someone's desk, or when I bring it home to my parents or something, and be like, have you read this? Have you read this?
That hasn't gone away. Like, I finish books, or I finish my issues of the New Yorker, and I put them out on the front of my house, and people walk by and take them. And there's all these little free library things that
are the free libraries. I love that.
Right?
I love that.
I'm grabbing books from them all the time. I grab books from my kids, the regular library, which is the big free library. We have that, and we can look up anything on Google, and we can download anything we want. And sometimes we do all of that in every day. That's building a future where we've seen what are the things that we value, and that's to me progress.
If we go back to that moment just before the pandemic, what we appreciated about cities was being outside among people, cacophony, restaurants. There was a growing movement of kind of immersive experiences, because we were kind of like over goggles. We wanted in-depth immersive experiences. Some were kind of VR based, and and so now, of course, we've receded. People like the suburbs more, and so it will be interesting. And the other phenomenon we're seeing is like our downtown cities have been eviscerated, but neighborhoods are doing very well. People are, because we had outdoor dining and stuff, right? So this yearning for stuff has moved around, and one of the reasons I showed that silly ad and stuff earlier is there's real interesting speculation about when we come back. Will we yearn to be more together and more connected than ever before? Will there be? Will we overcome that reticence? If you look at some of the statistics, I have slides here, but I'll just tell you what they are. If you look across the board, like here in San Francisco or in Texas or anywhere, use of public transit is way down. That's really hurt, right? Cars are way up. Going to restaurants and stores is way down. Except in New Zealand, where the pandemic ended, all of that swung back. It's back to the baseline. People are going to stores and restaurants, everything as much, except they're not using public transit. That, at least so far, persisted. They're sticking with their cars. And likewise the suburban trend. But, Mick, in another show we'll do a statistical review of what happened in this last year.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens when we can congregate again. I mean, for the moment, it's going to be really weird. I got to say, as much as I miss hugging people and, shaking hands and all casual social contact, it's going to be really weird. I mean, even watching a movie now, go and watch some concert footage. It is deeply uncomfortable to imagine yourself going into a stadium and closely packed with people, even a bar. Like, it's well,
but we also keep talking about this like the pandemic will be over, but this is the biological century. I mean, 54 kilobits, which is about the number of base pairs that the virus has. It's less than a Word document of information. It's inert. It's just the USB stick that plugs into your cell and convinces your cell to make it. And we've entered a biological century, and it actually accelerated the synthetic biology movement because we were able to do a vaccine in less than a year. That's impossible. So this is just our trainer pandemic, sadly. And I think we need to really remember that. Like, this was our prep. And we have a lot of work to do to believe that it's not going to be, a shift back and forth between dancing and locking down.
Well, and this is again why I talked about habits quickly becoming the way we do things, temporary measures, because I think it's obvious to everybody that if this could happen once. First, it's almost kind of a fluke it didn't happen sooner. But the chances are of some different virus or mutation or whatever coming along next year or the year after are pretty high. So, I think that's going to start leaking into design in physical design, certainly new buildings. You're talking about building a hospital. I think any project that was in the works is now being redesigned to take different things into account. Very lasting change.
And I don't want to be too alarmist about it, because I actually think there's been some amazing strides in that world. It's just that we are entering the biological century, and we haven't really even talked about bacteria, which, there's some very dramatic stuff happening in the bacterial world. We talk about viruses, but bacteria evolves very quickly. But that said, it's just that it's a new part of the medium that we're coping with. There are now iGEM competitions, international genetic engineering, machine competitions for high school kids. And those kids are growing up to be unicorn co-founders of places like Ginkgo. I think actually one of them is. And so, it's sort of, we've got a generational thing happening as well in this sort of understanding of the bio and the boundaries between atoms and bits and minds and energy units are collapsing in interesting ways. I think great promise, but the medium is.
In fact, if McLuhan were to write
Understanding
Media today, we know there would have been the chapters on IT, on artificial intelligence and bots. But of course, you're pointing out that these new extension are actually the biological ones we program, which behave, I think, very much, Andrew, like media did, and that we control them, we interact with them. Thoughts on these kind of emerging things? These fit into the canon of extensions of ourselves, new tools?
Well, you won't be able to get wings until you're 18 years old because, your parents shouldn't decide that, right? I think that's something that if you're going to manipulate your genetic code, you should be at least 18. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think we certainly get to a point where, and I think we're getting to that point where innovation is turning inward, and you have people like Elon Musk who want to put chips in everybody's heads. I think technology is going in, and that comes down to genetic manipulation, and it comes into all kinds of different things. Transhumanism, I think is a reflection of that, and it's kind of a matter of time. But the interesting thing is when the world fights back, and to me this the environment fights back, and we're seeing that with our natural ecology, and I think reactions to our artificial ecologies, and you can't help feeling that viruses and bacteria are getting in on the action a little bit there.
This may be an interesting point to put a bookmark in and return to the real world. And Andrew, remind me, the last exhibit we did at Gray Area, The End of You, which was the beginning of We, was looking at it was the end of human exceptionalism, or it put on the table, perhaps we've been human exceptionalists, and in all of these natural systems that might be wrong. Michael, did you write something? Did I see you did a piece on transhumanism where you're looking at topics like this, or is that something else in New Atlantis?
It wasn't in the New Atlantis. I wrote a bit about it on the old blog, just sort of seeing that as the natural eschatology of some of the trends in technology going back to early modern writers like Francis Bacon and onwards. And I think this is a fundamental question for us, whether we, and I see it as sort of underlying a lot of the discussions we've had, whether the body is good or whether the body is a problem to be solved. The human body, and that's a question of value, a very deep value. And for those that find the body to be a problem, then there's an inherent Gnostic temptation in all digital technology. And the question is whether that's something to be resisted or something to be given into. And my thinking is that the body is good, its limits are something to be celebrated, and that the Gnostic temptation should be resisted.
Michael, what's next? What you working on now?
I'm doing a lot of work with Ivan Illich at present. I'm teaching a couple of classes on his work, working on some lectures that will be turned into an article in the New Atlantis. Hopefully, that'll be sort of an invitation to Illich and the value of his thinking for our moment right now.
And Andrew, tell us about your upcoming class at Gray Area. You're resuming.
Yeah, this is great. We're picking it up March 20th, and we're coming in. So UMI, the first part was part 1 of Understanding Media, the first 7 chapters, as well as a sort of preface to McLuhan to set the stage. The bulk of the book is actually in part 2, where Marshall looks at technologies from speech to airplanes and bicycles to money and automation and computers. So we're going to tackle the first half of the second part starting March 20th. And
we would find that at Gray Area, or would we find more about
Gray
that?
Area? They should be dropping the open page probably early next week. You can follow me on Twitter, the McLuhan Institute.
It's at grayarea.org, and also one can the previous 12 episodes, one can sign up and listen to all of that, which is a very in-depth moving through Understanding Media with all of Marshall's annotation, and then you're running off to the library and getting related work. It was great.
Yeah, thank you.
David, what are you up to next?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Andrew. Sorry to interrupt. I'll just finish that. I am working on making the first 12 classes available. And I do actually have to run now because the physical world, my boys are getting off the school bus at the bottom of the lane here in about 2 minutes.
Andrew, thank you. Michael, thank you. And David, let's talk about what's next in your front. Andrew, we'll see you on the internet.
Thank you so much.
I like Andrew, I got to get my kids, and I have to go buy bread because it's Friday and I'm Jewish and it's the Sabbath, and I have to. My Gnostic self needs bread still.
Yeah.
But this is the book that I've just started writing. So I'm researching. I'm gonna continue calling and speaking to people. I'll probably contact all of you individually to continue this conversation because it's been so wonderful. But I really, what I'm doing over the next year is looking at what we've learned from this past year, what we learned about analog, what we've learned about digital, and how we're going to take what we've learned about each in our own individual lives, collectively as the we, but in our own lives, and build that future that we want and that works for us.
We'll have to direct you back to some of the 60 Quarantimes, because in the middle of it, we were looking at how were people adapting funerals, how were people adapting to different communications media, and so we want to pull that together. But you're thinking about this. I'd love to offer that to you.
I'd love it,
Michael.
please.
Thank you so much.
So glad to be here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Mickey, what's coming up?
What's coming up? We have a Wonder episode. When You Wonder, it'll be happening in early April. There's a brand new book coming out about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and about learning and wonder, and how when you wonder, you learn. And we'll have Greg Bear from the executive director of the Grable Foundation and some other guests to really help us think about being a kid again, the work of childhood, and what we could learn from Mr. Rogers and wonder. So we're going to have some other guests that help us think about wonder.
Yep.
But we've got a number of other kind of episodes percolating around, so I'm super excited. What about you? What do you think is next?
Well, I'm excited about we have one with Wilson coming up, don't we?
Yeah, we'd love to get David Sloan Wilson on and Eleanor Ostrom back from the dead, and some other people to talk about sort of pro-social and evolution and how we might learn from Darwin beyond just the evolution of multicellular bodies, but what happens when we have multicellular or multi-level selection, and why do we cooperate so well as humans? Is that actually an outcome of evolution? Why do we build cities? And are there some underlying patterns, design patterns that kind of must be true in a sort of pro-social world where we actually learn the better parts instead of the kind of naive understanding of, survival of the fittest. It has been used quite a lot in market economies to say, only the strong will survive. But it turns out there are a lot more nuances than that. And so we're looking forward to having that. We haven't set up the time yet.
It is our upcoming month of, I guess, as everyone will be doing, looking back over this last year, our digging into kind of our own history. And we also have an interesting project where a group of researchers are kind of pouring through the last year of quarantine to help us understand how we changed our relationship to science. All of that is coming up. And I would tell you what time it is, but since we're taping this early, we're disembodied. We actually don't have any.
We don't
idea.
even know. We don't
and
exist
that
in time
itself. Who invented that? We don't know, but we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Let's get close, but not so close.